Hello everyone. So on this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the black codes I had mentioned previously in a video, but I want to take it further in depth because racism is a big thing, and it is something that it gets under my skin. Even just the little slightest remarks, or when I go into a store and I see like a white person kind of snub a black person, or, somebody telling somebody speaking of it in another language that they need to go back to wherever they came from, just all these random things that is racism. Like, it really irks me. And in class, for the human services part of the class, it kind of ties in with what I'm doing with the criminal justice part. Because my criminal justice class, we are talking and discussing things like race in prisons, like I did the video about, different aspects of how we got to where we are in the prison system, and the mass incarcerations, and the fact that most people in prison are African Americans. Like, they only represent like 13% of America, but their numbers of representation in prison is way up there. And it's crazy that in 2023, we still have to discuss the fact that slavery still affects today. We have a lot of laws that prevent it. But when racism comes into play and somebody wants to seek justice, it's very seldom that justice is served. And it's a sad part of American history. So the Black Codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force after slavery was abolished during the Civil War. Though the Union victory had given some 4 million enslaved people their freedom, the question of freed black slaves' status into the post-war South was still very much unresolved. Under black codes, many states required black people to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. Outrage over black codes helped undermine support for President Andrew Johnson and the Republican Party. So even after slavery was abolished, they made laws that basically kept them as slaves, but they were telling them that they were free. When President Abraham Lincoln announced the impending passage of the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863, the stakes of the Civil War shifted dramatically. A Union victory would mean no less than revolution in the South, where the peculiar institution of slavery had dominated economic, political, and social life in the antebellum years. In April 1865, as the war drew to a close, Lincoln shocked many by proposing limited suffrage for African Americans in the South. He was assassinated days later. However, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, would be the one to preside over the beginning of the Reconstruction. Johnson, a former senator from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union during the war, was a firm supporter of states' rights and believed the federal government had no say in issues such as voting requirements at state level. Under his Reconstruction policies, which began in May 1865, the former Confederate states were required to uphold the abolition of slavery, which were made official by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, swear loyalty to the Union, and pay off their war debt. Beyond those limitations, the state and the ruling class, traditionally dominated by white planters, were given a relatively free hand in rebuilding their own governments. Even as former enslaved people fought to assert their independence and gain economic autonomy during the earliest years of Reconstruction, white landowners acted to control the labor force through a system similar to the one that had existed during slavery. To that end, in late 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enacted the first black codes. Mississippi's law required black people to have written evidence of employment for the coming year each January. If they left before the end of the contract, they would be forced to forfeit earlier wages and were subject to arrest. In South Carolina, a law prohibited black people from holding any occupation other than farmer or servant unless they paid an annual tax of $10 to $100. This provision hit free black people already living in Charleston and former slave artisans especially hard. In both states, black people were given heavy penalties for vagrancy, including forced plantation labor in some cases. Under Johnson's Reconstruction policies, nearly all the Southern states would enact their own black codes in 1865 and 1866. While the codes granted certain freedoms to African Americans, including the right to buy and own property, marry, make contracts, and testify in court, but only in cases involving people of their own race, their primary purpose was to restrict black people's labor and activity. Some states limited the type of property that black people could own, while virtually all the former Confederate states passed strict vagrancy and labor contract laws, as well as so-called anti-enticement measures designed to punish anyone who offered higher wages to a black laborer already under contract. Black people who broke labor contracts were subject to arrest, beating, and forced labor, and apprenticeship laws forced many minors, either orphans or those whose parents were deemed unable to support them by a judge, into unpaid labor for white planters. Passed by a political system in which black people effectively had no voice, the black codes were enforced by all white police and state militia forces, often made up of Confederate veterans of the Civil War, all across the South. The restrictive nature of the codes and widespread black resistance to their enforcement enraged many in the North who argued that the codes violated the fundamental principles of free labor ideology. After passing the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto, Republicans in Congress effectively took control of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection of the Constitution to former enslaved people and enact universal male suffrage before they could rejoin the Union. The 15th Amendment, adopted in 1870, guaranteed that a citizen's right to vote would not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. During this period of radical Reconstruction in 1867 through 1877, Black men won election to Southern state governments and even to the U.S. Congress. As indicated by the passage of the Black Codes, however, white Southerners showed a steadfast commitment to ensuring their supremacy and the survival of plantation agriculture in the post-war years. Support for Reconstruction policies waned after the early 1870s, undermined by the violence of white supremacist organizations such as the KKK. By 1872, when the last federal soldiers left the South and Reconstruction drew to a close, Black people had seen little improvement in their economic and social status, and the vigorous efforts of white supremacist forces throughout the region had undone the political gains they had made. Discrimination would continue in America with the rise of the Jim Crow laws, but would inspire the civil rights movements to come. Now, in another video, probably tomorrow if I have a chance, I have to go to work, and I figure I will probably just go to the park or something and try to do a couple more videos to upload them, where maybe I can find some quiet. I don't know. Quiet is not in my vocabulary these days. But I will read through all of the laws that was written for the Black Codes. I have them here. Some of these, I don't know. I don't even have words for them, honestly. You know, how can you free people and then make laws that just keep them chained? It makes no sense to me. But as I was saying, I will try to go tomorrow after work to a park or something where I can actually sit down and read through all of these codes that was put into law. So if anyone has any questions about these codes or anything, feel free to comment below and I will try to answer them as I do my next video about them. Have a good night, everybody, and say no to racism.